Well, hey, friends, Eric Nevins here. We are going to get the show started in just a moment. But before we do, I forgot to mention something during the interview with my guest today. My guest is Amos Smith. He's an author, he is a pastor, and he's a little bit of a mystic. And so we talk about some really interesting ideas and things that I think will, at the very least, challenge you to grow or think a little bit differently about your spiritual journey, which I think is Amos's goal. But but I also, if you're interested in his book, he wanted me to mention that you can actually get a free copy of it just by sending an email. So the only thing he asks in exchange is a review on Amazon. I don't know if you know this, but when you do reviews, especially when you're putting out a book, when it's coming out, your pre-orders and your book reviews is how Amazon knows that, hey, this book actually has some traction and some people want it, so maybe we'll show it to more people. So if you want a copy of the book, just email. I'm going to give you the email right now. It's Rachel M at paracletepress.com. I'm going to spell that out. RACHELM, as in Mary, at Paraclete Press. And that is spelled PARACLETEPRESS.com. Okay. Rachel M at paracletepress.com. Just let her know that you heard Amos on Halfway There and that you'd love a copy of the book to review for Amazon. Okay. They will send it to you probably in a PDF. That's how I got it. And it's really, really an interesting book to look at. And Amos is going to tell us all about that right now. Okay. So again, Rachel M at Paraclete, I don't know why I can't talk this morning, paracletepress.com if you want to get a book for review. We talked about that after our conversation, so I wanted to make sure we got it in here. Here is my conversation with Amos. Well, welcome, friends, to Halfway There. This is the show where we have honest conversations with ordinary Christians about today's Christian experience. I'm excited about this conversation today. I'm going to bring to you a conversation that may challenge a little bit of what you know about spiritual disciplines and just in prayer. So it might expand what you think about prayer a little bit. I hope so. So I'm happy to welcome to the show progressive pastor and contemplative author Amos Smith. Amos, welcome to Halfway There.
Thank you, Eric. I appreciate it. Thanks for having me on the show. I enjoy your show. Appreciate your time.
Yeah, I'm really glad to make the connection. We've been connected a little bit through Rich Lewis, who has been on the show in the past. And I'm glad to just connect and hear a little bit about your contemplative journey, because I know that it's definitely interesting. So tell us a little bit about who you are and where you are now, and then we'll ask a few questions and go back. So,
okay. Well, my story in a nutshell is that I was a competitive athlete in high school, and I was captain of my wrestling team, and I had a lot of athletic discipline. And then in 1999. I did a centering prayer retreat at Snowmass, Colorado at Benedict's Monastery, and I met Thomas Keating for the first time. And I was eating with Thomas Keating at dinner, and I remember he said to me, if you practice 40 minutes a day centering prayer, and if you do one extended retreat every year of at least 6 to 10 days, he said, you will make progress. And so I really applied that athletic discipline that I had to what Keating said. And I just carried out exactly what he said. I just practiced 40 minutes a day, rarely missing. And I did an extended retreat every year. And as a result, it did transform me, but not in a big, showy way. Basically, one of the main things it did is it helped me to survive in Christian ministry, because in Christian ministry, in a couple of churches that I served, I experienced huge curveballs. And I was able to withstand, all that because anybody who knows about Christian ministry in the 21st century, it's tumultuous.
Sure.
There's just a lot of push and pull. There's a lot of polarization. There's a lot of dysfunctional families. So anyway, the centering prayer really became my root. It became the grace that held me and helped me to continue to be a minister to this day. So.
Yeah. So you're a pastor now.
Yes, I'm currently taking a short break, but yes, I've been a minister for 18 years.
Okay, great. So that's a great little bit of background about centering prayer. Why don't we just go ahead and define centering prayer? I want to hear more about why that was attractive to you by going through your story in just a minute. But tell us about what centering prayer is and why discipline matters in it.
Well, I guess to begin with discipline, because I do think that's the root. I think that's the core. Is my frustration with centering prayer, even before we start getting into the practice itself and what it's like. My frustration is a lot of people who go into centering prayer, they take this laissez-faire attitude towards it, and they just kind of dabble, and they pick it up, and then they drop it, and then they pick it up again. But, if you applied that kind of laissez-faire attitude to playing the violin, you would never get good. And so, the same kind of discipline that's required to learn a musical instrument well, or to be competitive at a sport, that same discipline is required in meditation. And, the authors of the Philokalia, an ancient book in Christian mysticism, they knew that, and they were disciplined. And as a result of their discipline, they really did, transform their consciousness and transform their bodies, their minds. But without that discipline, progress is going to be partial, and people are just going to stay in their dualistic minds, and they're just not going to really enter into another category of being, which is really. I don't know. It's kind of a charlatan's approach. I mean, a lot of people who write about, a lot of these, deeper states of consciousness, they really haven't gotten there. They don't have the discipline, to really get there. And I know that's harsh to say, but this thing is real, and it has an ancient tradition, and it's a important and significant discipline, like playing the violin, or doing a sport well. And so it shouldn't just be, come at willy-nilly. And then, write a bunch of blah, 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 there's a lot of blather out there, I think, that isn't really rooted, not really disciplined. It just seems like kind of new age, verbiage, and it's hard to make, this or that of it. So that's where I'm coming from, is bringing more like respect and reverence, to an ancient and powerful tradition.
Yeah. Okay. So what is centering prayer?
So centering prayer is the Cloud of Unknowing, which is a book of Christian mysticism written in England by an unknown author. I'm trying to remember when it was written. I think it was 14th century. Anyway, it's taking the practices of that book and making them accessible and just commonly available to people. So it's about picking a prayer word. You don't get too fixated on the word, but there's a word that reminds you to come back from whatever distractions you're currently dabbling in, and to come back to the present moment. And then when you do that over and over again, you begin to experience more and more stillness in your mind. And I think one of the best ways to talk about it is, in between your thoughts, there's a space. And what centering prayers helps you to do is to increase that space in between thoughts. But it does much, much more than that. I mean, especially if you go on extended retreats, what happens is you go into such a deep place of relaxation. It's much deeper than sleep can take you. And because of the profound relaxation, any kind of latent tension that's in your body will start to remove itself. So you have intense tensions in your back, shoulders, jaw, wherever you hold your tension, and it'll start to dissipate. I mean, it'll be excruciating at first. It's what Thomas Keating refers to as unloading. in the centering prayer tradition, but there's this unloading of tension. And that's what's been so liberating to me, is I used to hold lots of tension in my back, like amazing amounts of tension. And over the years of centering prayer, that tension has dissipated. I mean, I'm just so much more relaxed and at ease, and sleep better at night. Concentrate and focus much better. So that's that's basically what centering prayer is extending the period of time when you have no thoughts. And probably the best analogy I know of for this is training a puppy to sit in the middle of a circle. Now, if you ever try this, it's completely frustrating, because every time you bring the puppy to the center of the circle, it's going to wander, and it's going to wander immediately. And then you gently bring it back, and then it wanders again. And then you bring it back, and then it wanders again. And it's monotonous. But what will happen is, if you keep up with it, and that's the main thing, is if you have the discipline to keep up with it, what will happen over time is that the puppy will actually sit in the middle of that circle for 5 seconds, which is a triumph, And then in time, if you keep doing it, the puppy will sit in the middle of the circle for a minute, or even 2 or 3 or 4 minutes. And that's when you start to experience what I'm talking about, which is a whole nother level of consciousness, a whole nother level of relaxation, peace, joy. And it takes time, though, and it's like training that puppy.
Yeah, well, it's a way of really calming your thoughts before the Lord and giving him space to speak to you. Is that too simple a definition?
Yeah, but the calming of the thoughts, that implies that the thoughts are still there.
Sure.
And ultimately, and this is where the leap of faith comes in, is ultimately you get to a place where there's no thoughts, there's no images, there's no sensations, there's nothing that is binary, there's nothing that you can name, there's nothing you can think about. And some people think, well, that's scary. And it is scary. There's a certain level of terror in that, because people think, well, what the hell's left then? Is there just some big void? But that's the adventure of the mystic, is to explore that profound question of what's left when my mind is just completely still, completely placid, no thoughts, no nothing. And what the mystic will find is there is a presence that no words can touch, that just sends shivers of joy, up our spinal columns, and gives us a deep and profound sense of belonging and homecoming, and being at home in the world. And this to me is like the ultimate prodigal son, kind of experience. It being embraced by the Abba at the deepest level. The Abba is no longer talking, Daddy is no longer talking to you. He just got you in his embrace. And all you don't have to think anymore. You don't have to say anything to him. He just has you in that bear hug, and you're home. So that, I think, is ultimately, where the thing takes you.
Yeah. Okay. So how did you originally come to Christ? And tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I in high school, I went to an evangelical church. I was part of an evangelical youth group. I went and saw some amazing, Christian rock concerts, and I was into the Christian rock scene. Even to this day, I enjoy Christian rock. I just went to see David Crowder with my wife.
Oh, nice.
And I've, my wife and I have seen, Third Day and Jars of Clay and Newsboys, and a lot of the people on the, contemporary Christian rock scene, and we enjoy that. But I really wasn't sure what I wanted to do with my life, and I thought maybe I wanted to teach comparative religion, or maybe I wanted to become a minister, but I wasn't sure which. So I decided to make up my mind. I would go to northern India, and I would study Hindi and Sanskrit at the Landau Language School in Uttar Pradesh. So I went out there to northern India, and I was studying Hindi and Sanskrit, and I decided after about 3 or 4 months of that it wasn't for me. And so,
why did you decide that?
Because I don't think languages are really my thing, and Hindi and Sanskrit are, I mean, they're what they call class 5 languages. So after 1 year of Hindi or Sanskrit, you're at the same place you'd be after 3 months of a Romance language like Spanish
Oh, wow.
or French. So, well, not French. French is higher up there, but anyway, it's a very difficult language, and so I just realized it wasn't for me. Then I had this dream that I was in this cathedral, and it was one of those really significant dreams, that for me it just kind of changed the direction of my life, and I was in this cathedral, and light started pouring in. And I just saw all this light coming into the cathedral. And then I heard, not audibly, but I heard in the dream, it said, "Teach the love of Jesus." And I woke up, wide-eyed, because it was, for whatever reason, it was like a gripping, dream.
Yeah.
But I realized, okay, this is the answer to my question. I need to become a minister. So when I got back to the U.S., I immediately enrolled in seminary, and I went into Christian ministry, and I've been a minister in churches from, Montana to Washington to Arizona.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, so then you went to study Sanskrit. I mean, that seems like you already have had this kind of, I mean, that seems mystical by itself, right? Did you already have this kind of mystical sensibility about you?
Well, my real first introduction to mysticism, and that's a good point. But I used to be a mountain climber, and after college, and well, during high school and after high school too, I climbed a lot of mountains throughout the world, and I was just I was really into mountain climbing, and there was something about once you got up high and the air was thin. I would get to these places where I knew without a doubt that I was part of something much, much bigger than myself. And it was visceral, it was something that I experienced it in my bones. And so that was really my first introduction to, what later I developed through centering prayer. But I had those experiences of being connected, and that I'm part of something beautiful, that there is a creator, that, that all of this stuff is intricately woven together with amazing symmetry and poise. And I'm part of this, and I'm connected to it all. And so that was really my first introduction, to mysticism. And maybe I was prepared for it somewhat, by the evangelical church, but yeah, the mountain climbing is what really did it for me.
Yeah, I think in your book, Be Still and Listen, I think you call that nature mysticism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's a long legacy of that in the Christian tradition. Saint Patrick was what I would call a nature mystic, and Desjardins was definitely nature mystic, and so was Saint Francis. They just had this deep reverence for the natural world and for its divine origins. And so, and they lifted that out. So,
yeah, what I love about that is, and you talk a little bit about Genesis 1. I think the whole thing of observing the world, and, God he creates the world and he calls it good and he gives it to us. And, we have to deal with sin and all the consequences of that. But I think we can still see that, I mean, good theology says that, right? God is revealed in what he has made, and it tells us a little bit about who he is. And I think that feeling of, most of us have had that. Sounds like you've had a lot on top of a mountain or a high range or something where you're looking and you get the sense, I'm actually really small here, and there's something much bigger going on, and it's not just this pile of rocks.
Oh yeah, definitely. And my 9-year-old son has that. I mean, he
Right.
just, he goes on we walk the dog every day, the whole family, we go out and walk the dog. And sometimes he just stops and he looks up at the blue sky, and I know what he's thinking in his head. He's thinking, this thing is crazy, I mean, and see, adults lose that. And psychologists tell us that that we all had that as children, but then over the years we suppress it. And, our dualistic, reasoning minds kind of take over everything. But and I think there's a reason why in Scripture it says that the kingdom of heaven belongs to a child. And it doesn't mean that we need to be childish by any means, but it means that we need to let go of all those filters and all those ways that we've suppressed that and reintegrate that awe and that wonder that my son has into our adult lives, and so to re-enchant our lives so that they're not just, plodding through the workday or whatever, that they have a glimmer of the absolute and the infinite. Even in the most mundane things, we get this feeling that, I'm part of something that is mysterious and millions of years old, and that it's full of mystery.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Okay, so nature kind of led you to become a mystic. How did you begin to discover some of the like Desert Fathers, and because your previous book called Healing the Divide, which is all about like kind of connecting us back to some of those people and some of those traditions. How did you discover them?
Well, see, I guess what happened is as I started to see more and more holistically, as I started to be more and more steeped and marinated in this silence and stillness, I began to just want to see things in a fresh new way. So Healing the Divide is about seeing Jesus with a mystical mind, is what I hope it does.
Yeah.
I mean, mystical, sometimes I hesitate to use the word because it can sound pretentious, and I know a lot of evangelicals just don't like the word, but I use it anyway, and I just try to define it, for myself. And so yeah, it started in the natural world, and then I wanted to apply that presence of mind, that steeped, stillness and silence to Jesus. And that was my first book. Second book is about applying that same mind to Scripture. And then my third book, which I've already written, and Richard Rohr gave the foreword for it, and it's getting tossed around by various publishers right now.
Awesome.
But it's about the Philokalia, and so it's and that to me is like, if you want to look at Christian mysticism's deepest roots, for me they're in the Philokalia. I mean, the Philokalia has some problems, but overall, it shows us a legacy of Christian mysticism. It's not just, there's this obscure mystic over there that lived in that time, and then there's one that appeared over here and, lived in that time. This is a tradition, that went from the 3rd century, through to the 16th century. And there was continuity throughout. And so that really draws me now, so that's going to be my third book is on the Philokalia.
Oh, so interesting. Okay, so tell us, because my guess is that most of my listeners have never heard of the Philokalia. And and here's the thing, I've just come across it in your writings, but that's pretty much it. And I have a background in spiritual formation, so I've done some of these readings. So, but I hadn't really heard of that one. So tell us a little bit about what's in there and why that's kind of important.
Well, and that's really the reason for the book, is that I go to these workshops and, retreats in Christian contemplative tradition, and I never hear about the Philokalia. And to me, that's similar to going to a classical music convention and never hearing the name Mozart.
Yeah.
I mean, it just makes no sense. Here you have this incredible piece of work. And for me, it just goes back to the schism between East and West. That, Western scholasticism and, contemplative tradition has gone its own direction. And then the Eastern Church has gone its direction, and never the two shall meet. And that's one of the real tragedies of Christian tradition as a whole.
Yeah, I agree.
But I think it's time in the 21st century, to take this great classic of the Eastern Church and to, make it accessible to the West.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's why we haven't heard of it, because we don't have a perspective that's outside of the West. And
right.
So interesting. I've had some interesting conversations with friends lately about how they've been attracted to some of the Eastern Orthodox churches kind of view of things, and that they don't have some of the separations and some of the problems that we have with trying to make everything fit into a theology.
Right.
Little bit more of a appreciation for mystery and wonder, and it's okay for everything doesn't have to fit in the boxes.
Definitely, definitely, and it has these shining lights. Like, I mean, well, we own this saint too, but of all the authors of the Philokalia, I just tell people, if you just want to read one author, just read Maximus the Confessor. To me, I mean, Maximus literally blew my mind. I mean, when I read him, he gave words to stuff that I had been experiencing that nobody else gave words to. And so, and that to me is the problem with the Philokalia. It's too big. It's just, it's a compendium of 4 books translated in English. Nobody has time for that stuff. So what I did in my book, which I hope comes out, next year or so, is that I just take, 2 or maybe 3 authors from each of those 4 books. And then I expand on those, but I don't try to bite off the whole thing and chew it, because it's just way too much. I just try to take a few of the most significant authors in my mind and elaborate on them. So that's another reason why the Philokalia, I think, is just unknown in the West. Is it just seems too unwieldy to people, or just too huge, or they just they just don't know even where to start. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, I think another I don't know how to say this. Another issue that people sometimes have is it just seems strange, right? It's not. It can be a little bit, it's obviously foreign, but it's also, we're so trained to care about truth, and truth is important, of course. Wouldn't ever say it's not, but we wonder about, well, can it be true if it hasn't been filtered through our theology? I don't know. How do you deal with that?
Well, and here it goes back to, I have this background of like studying Hindi and Sanskrit, and
Hmm.
I studied comparative religion in college, and so, for me, one of the things about the Philokalia that resonates is, as I studied the different mystical traditions of the world religions, I realized that there's consistent themes throughout. And 2 just basic consistent themes is a reverence for stillness and silence, and that comes forth in different forms of meditation. Of course, for us, it's Psalm 46, verse 10. Be still and know that I'm God.
Yeah.
Now, in the Philokalia, they have their own translation of Psalm 46, verse 10, and it says, "Practice stillness and know God." And that particular verse is so significant to the authors of the Philokalia and to the Eastern Church that it's written above monastery doors. So
Wow.
as you enter into the monastery, you see it. It says, practice stillness and know God. So these different mystical traditions, they revere stillness and silence, and then they also have repetitive prayers to ground the mind. And the Eastern Church and the Philokalia in particular emphasize the Jesus prayer, and it's the most ancient repetitive prayer in Christian tradition that we have. It's even more ancient than the Rosary, and and so these 2 things come up as primary throughout the Philokalia, and it's one of the things that just convinces us that this is definitely within the subject of mysticism, and it is Christian mysticism, and for me, it's Christian mysticism at its best. And the theology throughout there is amazing theology too. It's all grounded in Scripture, and the authors of the Philokalia, they quote Scripture throughout, and especially the stuff that emphasizes humility. Humility is everything in the Philokalia. It's the starting point of wisdom. It's the starting point of discernment. It's also the starting point, paradoxically, of greatness. Is that first you have to realize that you're nothing before God.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so interesting. I think that's so. Here's a thought that I had, and I hesitate to share it a little bit, but sometimes I think our theology produces the opposite of humility. It produces pride. Um, which I don't know. I don't know if I want to go too far into that, but it's intriguing to me.
No, I totally agree with you, and that's why so many mystics, especially after the Protestant churches became fragmented and refragmented over and over and over again, because everybody was just so invested in being right. And my interpretation of Scripture is right. Your interpretation is wrong, and so there's another split, and then there's another split, and over again until we have, over 5,000 denominations that we have now. And so mystics through the ages have cried out, why has the Christian Church substituted the bridal chamber, for the courtroom? Why is there this emphasis on the courtroom? The emphasis should be the Song of Songs. It should be the marriage of the soul with Christ. It should be about this mystical union with Christ. It should not be about all this legalistic, I'm right and you're wrong stuff. It's just gotten us nowhere.
Yeah.
So, so that to me is one of the tragedies of Protestant tradition. All the fragmentation.
Yeah, I agree. And so that's what's interesting about your book, Be Still and Listen, about Scripture, is I've come to this place where I've decided. I mean, I'm trying. My undergrad is in biblical studies, and then I have an MDiv too. So I've done a lot of taking apart of texts and whatever, and studying, and that all has its place, I guess. But eventually, I realized this is not. It doesn't actually produce knowledge of God. Like I can understand the text, but I don't necessarily know who God is. It might lead to worship sometimes, but it's not always the same kind of experience. And I think what you're suggesting that we have, or try or strive for more, is experience God through Scripture and through silence and stillness.
Yes, and there are certain root scriptures that we return to again and again, and one of them is Matthew 6:6. It says, "Go into your room and close the door, and pray to your God who is in secret, and then God who knows what you're doing in secret will reward you." Now, the interesting thing about this particular passage, and it's something that's been quoted in the Philokalia and quoted by many, Thomas Keating refers to it often as the basis of centering prayer. But one of the interesting things about it is that in those times in Palestine, people had a 1 or 2 room house, and they usually had very large families. So the house was always bustling, with people running through. So obviously, go into your room and close the door is not an actual, thing that's based on a room in the house. It's metaphorical, and what you're doing is you're closing the door to the senses. That's how it's been interpreted, by many, mystics throughout. But you're closing the door to sensations, to images, to smells, to tastes, to sounds. And as a result of that, you enter into a different world that is not based on the senses. It's based on what the Philokalia and other authors like Callistos Ware, who's an East Orthodox author, refer to as the spiritual faculties. That the spiritual faculties are not based on the senses. They're based on this deeper place that we can go, that's beyond the senses. So that the whole point of something like centering prayer is to close that door and to find out that there's another world beyond the senses.
Yeah, so interesting. I'm not even sure what else to ask about that, because I want to just try to practice it for a while and see what happens.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you: have you ever had a dark night of the soul, or a time when God felt far away?
Oh, I've had several. I mean, I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but
Sure.
I've had a lot of suffering in my life. Just a lot of really harsh circumstances that have presented themselves and that have just pummeled me. And I've just thought to myself, God, you didn't have my back. You didn't prevent this from happening. Why should I even care about you? And look at how you treat your saints. You don't have their back either. They just get, martyred and hung upside down and kicked in the head. And so what the hell, what kind of friend are you anyway? I mean, Abraham talks about God being his friend in Genesis, but what kind of friend, treats you that way, But then I read these other scriptures that say, God only admonishes, those whom he loves. And so, I still honestly, I have a lot of questions. I still wrestle with a lot of things. And I guess I prefer that to half-baked answers. I know there's a lot of people who just say, okay, well, I came to this confident conclusion. I don't know, maybe I've just been doing meditation too long, but I'm okay with leaving some questions unanswered and just, leaving some things open,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, interesting. So, how did those experiences did they lead you to more meditation, or did they lead you how did they shape how you understood God?
For me, what meditation became, what centering prayer became, was I was out at sea and there was the perfect storm, and the waves are coming over the boat. I don't even know if me or my crew is going to survive. And what centering prayer became for me is an anchor. It's like everything else is topsy turvy. I can't make sense of a damn thing. But one thing I do have is this anchor, and it is stable, and it is resilient, and it is solid, and it is ancient, and I can rely on that. And so that's become really what I teach and why I keep going forward, and no matter what obstacles come. It's because I really believe in centering prayer. It's not something I just do for fun, or as a hobby or whatever. It's it's the reason that I'm here at all, and that I have a family that's doing well, and I'm still in ministry.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think that is helpful, and I think for many, especially of us of the evangelical tradition, we just don't have many of those anchors. There's a point. My understanding is that the dark night helps us to kind of move and shed some of those things that we build up to make ourselves feel safe, that may or may not necessarily reflect God and his heart for us. Um, so that we can move into things like this, and we can know God and know ourselves a lot better.
Well, and I have to be honest. I mean, there have been times in Christian rock concerts when there's something about and it doesn't happen every time, but there's some times when I've just felt like I'm just part of this big, amazing group of people. This flow. We're all experiencing the music at the same time. I feel energized, and I feel just unequivocal praise for God. I mean, that's great. That's a powerful form of prayer. But I think eventually, I think eventually, I think it was Brian McLaren, who I know a lot of people have challenges with McLaren, but I think he's kind of this funny, he just kind of dabbles in everything. But one of the things McLaren said that I thought was interesting is he said the evangelical church, and then the Pentecostal church were his introduction to contemplative prayer, and then the Catholic contemplative tradition were his I guess he used the word the college course or something. Like the Pentecostal church was his high school, and then the Catholic contemplative tradition became his college course. And I do think, Thomas Keating and contemplative outreach and the centering prayer movement, and they have a huge newsletter of like over 300,000 people, which for contemplatives is pretty big. And they, I think they just reach a lot of people. And there's more and more evangelicals and Protestants and all kinds of different people who are finding, who are getting connected there. So.
Yeah, which is a good thing. Definitely.
Yeah.
I think people are starting to be more more open to it. All right. Well, so anything else you want to leave us with before we wrap up here, Amos?
Well, there's one story, and it's from a different tradition, but I think it gives us a sense of what is possible through a discipline like centering prayer. I was in Berkeley, California, and I used to see different people that would come through Berkeley, and one of the people who came through was a Vietnamese monk who was a close friend of Thomas Merton. His name is Thich Nhat Hanh. Anyway, I was at this Thich Nhat Hanh convention, and I was having some snack during the convention, and I was talking to this guy, and as I talked to him, I realized he was a massage therapist, and he told me this story, which kind of blew my mind. He said he was in Plum Village in France, and he was at the Thich Nhat Hanh's main retreat center there. He's a Vietnamese Buddhist monk. And he went up to Thich Nhat Hanh and said, I'm a massage therapist. I'd like to give you a massage. Now, his understanding later was that he had been asked other times, if somebody would allow him to, or her to give him a massage. And he always refused as part of his monastic code. But for whatever reason, this one time, he said, you know what, this one time I'll let you. And so this guy gave Thich Nhat Hanh a massage, and he said it just completely blew his mind and his paradigm of what was possible, because he had been doing massage for 20 years, and in every single person he had ever massaged, they always had tension somewhere in their body, either in their shoulders or in their back or in their neck. There was always tension in their body somewhere. Thich Nhat Hanh was loose as a goose. He had no tension anywhere in his entire body. And this guy said he didn't even realize that was even possible. And see, that's the thing. I think a lot of people don't even realize, how meditation can transform everything. Your body, your mind, your nervous system. It can heal your nervous system. And I think that's what people need to know.
Yeah.
That the meditation is much deeper. It's much more profound. It's much more holistic than we give credit. And there's a lot of Christian monks in Christian tradition, especially in the Philokalia, who I know were at the same place as Thich Nhat Hanh, and so that's what's possible.
I love that. That is a great note to go out on. So, friends, if meditation in this way and centering prayer is new to you, that's okay. If it's intriguing to you, definitely go check out Amos and his work. I've got links to all of those things at halfwaytherepodcast.com. You'll find this episode, and we've talked about both of his books and even the one coming out. So and I've linked up all of those right there in the show notes to this page. Amos, thanks so much for being here. I'm really glad to again make the connection, but also just to hear from your heart a little bit about centering prayer and meditation. I'm challenged I need to do more of it. I want to get into it because I want to know God and I want to have less tension.
Well, Eric, I really appreciate your time. I know that some of the things I said have probably challenged some of your listeners, but I always think that if there's one thing Jesus did, throughout the Gospels, is he always stretched the comfort zone.
Yes.
And so, I think that's what we're all called to do is be stretched in different ways. And yeah, I really appreciate your time and letting me be on the show.
Yeah, I like that a lot, and that's a lot of what we're trying to do here is just stretch our understanding of the spiritual journey. It's actually a lot bigger than most of our churches are showing us, so that's why we're here.
Okay, thanks so much, Eric.